I would now like to introduce today's speakers. Amy Fong, partner, leads Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in global services categories. Banushi Malhotra is a practice director in Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises on clients on maximizing value through their supply-based engagements to obtain cost, business, and operational benefits. David Rickard, Vice President, leads Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management and customer experience management services offerings for EMEA clients, as well as select global accounts. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Amy.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. We are happy to have you here today. We have seen the state of the market and services change quite a bit over the last 12 to 24 months, and wanted to do this update for sourcing teams specifically as they struggle to meet their cost goals, meet their savings goals, and also combat this market of inflation and cost increases. So today we're going to start out by talking about the state of the market with specifically in services costs. We're mainly focused on outsourced services across ITS, across BPO, as well as other industry-specific services that may be outsourced at the operational level. We'll talk a little bit on the impact of these market drivers on costs and the behavior we're seeing from service providers. And then in the second part, we'll get through 5 survival strategies and talk a bit about what we have seen work and what advice we would give to sourcing teams, category managers, heads of indirect, CPOs on surviving this time and being prepared for the future. So with that, I want to start out with a poll. I'm curious to hear from all of you on the line who we have here. We have a great number of people on. And have you seen your costs rise in service categories over the last year? And for a lot of you, this will probably be over 2022. Yes, more than 10%. Yes, 10% or less. No. Anyone, costs have gone down? So far, none of you have had costs go down. And if you're unsure, or if you're a service provider, or if you're not, really buying from complex outsourced service firms, that's fine too. You can just mark unsure there. We'd love to get your thoughts as well. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so for everyone to click. We seem to have a good quorum here. You can go ahead and start the countdown to close it out. All right, so this is overwhelmingly a yes. And I'm actually, I can't say I'm at all surprised to see the results here. I think the magnitude might surprise some people that 48% of you have had 1 to 10% or 0 to, up to 10% increases, and almost 40% of you have had more than 10% increase in costs and service categories. That is significant. That's drastic. It's probably unprecedented for most of us. If you are a sourcing professional, if you've been in the industry for 10, 20, 25 plus years, I don't want to age anyone on this call, but some of us have been, and we probably haven't been through a period where costs for services have been going up in that direction so abruptly. It's always been about labor arbitrage and cost down, or same cost, better innovation, better service, access to talent, things like that. So it's really unprecedented for many of us in our careers. And I think we'll talk about that today. We'll talk a little bit about what's driving this talent or the talent shortage, and what's driving these costs, and what might be different now than what we've seen at other times in the last 10, 20 years. even the last 5 years in the procurement space, and how we need to be dealing with that. So let's start out with the where we are and what's happening. So for anyone who hasn't heard, who hasn't been in a restaurant, an airport, a service-related industry in the last 6 months, there's a talent shortage out there. There's a talent and staffing shortage across almost every company that we talk to. It's hard to get people, it's hard to retain them. We've got a little bit more granular data and how that relates in a second, but essentially when we talk about different geographies that are facing the talent shortage, the beginning of this year, it was really North America and Western Europe that were facing it the greatest, but pretty significant in India as well. This was our study on the left here back at the beginning of the year, and I would say that since then, 45, 43% is probably, I'm going to hazard a guess, more like 85, 90%. I don't talk to very many companies that don't feel some kind of pain, either through shortage in talent or inflation or costs going up. Why? There's a whole bunch of reasons. We are still recovering from COVID. COVID took a lot of people out of the workforce, either through early retirement. Unfortunately, the US lost 1 million people. That's a lot of workers. There's still a lot of absenteeism, even in our own organization, people still getting sick and being out for a week or two. And that really has a trickle effect when you look at any kind of services work. Where you're relying on people. We also have, immigration hasn't caught back up. So when we look at H-1B visas and things like that, there's a big lag there. We also have some demographic changes that I'll let David talk about in just a minute when we look across these different locations that are likely to be longer term. And then there's also a changing cultural view. So, there's so much talk about the Great Resignation, expectations and purpose and all of that. I think that's all very, valid and backed up by evidence and possibly for the best, but it certainly changes the availability of people and their willingness to work, 80 hours a week. You may get them for 40 hours a week, and that has an impact overall. The next slide, we look at the talent crunch and really what we're seeing in terms of attrition at the service providers. And those of you who source IT services probably recognize a lot of these names, and BPO, some of these providers are BPO providers as well. The industry is really set up to run at, if you look back at 2019, 2020, like an average of 15 to 17, 20% attrition is fairly typical in the outsourced services industry. We saw that drop down during COVID, and then we saw it pop right back up as we came out. And the last couple quarters, 2021 was very difficult for a lot of firms. Cognizant at the top, there's a bunch of different reasons for some of these, but really has affected. When you think about certain firms that your providers might be losing one third of their people on a regular basis, that's a big cycle through of headcount. David Benucci, comments on this?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you pointed out amongst the difference between service providers, right? So say, for instance, TCS, one of the reasons that would account for low attrition at TCS would probably be the cultural aspects related to the firm. They hire mostly in tier 2, tier 3 cities based in India, and there's typically less attrition when you move to those areas as a whole. And, even apart from that, I think the strategies that were followed by firms to deal with attrition, that's another thing that was very different. For instance, some of these firms were very aggressively hiring at premium rates at that time. They're struggling now because they've hired at premium rates at that point of time. But these strategies were also very different across firms. Some of them were just, sitting and waiting, watching waiting and watching for what could happen next.
Yeah. So, even if you look at this as kind of starting to flatten out, this last quarter, it seems like it's flattening out a little bit. The last 6 months and bringing people up to speed has been quite difficult, trying to fill all of those spots as there's attrition, as the attrition increased. I think the other thing we've seen, and this data is really from the first, the end of 2021, the first 6 months of this year, is that hiring lead times were significantly longer. And this slide specifically speaks to some IT skills, the IT skills that are most difficult to fill, most in demand. I always like looking at this because we have, skills like Kafka and Cucumber on here. But the key here is that, there's constantly evolving premium skills in IT. And some of these were taking, 2 to 3 months longer to acquire, and others 4 to 6 months longer to hire and onboard. When you're talking about that long, then you start to see companies hiring more and more in advance. And so you're competing, and there was just this big surge in demand at the beginning of the year of companies trying to early hire. And keep in mind that the work that's being done in these IT app type skills tends to be app development that's driving the business, right? It's customer facing activities, it's revenue, it's the digitalization of enterprises and the way they deliver their product or their services, which, we started those digital transformation projects years ago, but COVID really accelerated them. If you didn't have a good app to deal with your customers in early 2020, you had one by 2021. You had to develop that to stay in business. And that's just accelerated a lot of other work and put these skills in really high demand. So that definitely complicates it and has added to the some of the demand and maybe the increase in demand that's unbalanced against the supply. David, can you talk a little bit about the demographics that we're seeing as well? I think that's a big factor.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we are seeing, and we talk a lot about this, is that we're seeing less people coming into the workforce in places like Europe and in North America. So the younger generation, it's a smaller population that's coming through, which is meaning that typical definitely BPO roles, not so much maybe ITS roles where there's an element of skill and experience required, but the entry-level ITS roles or entry-level BPO roles, BPS roles, there are less people coming through from colleges and universities to actually fulfill those roles. And what you can see is that that's starting to make organizations think about their talent strategy. And we talk a little bit more in a couple of slides time about looking for new locations. But you can see on this slide that it shows that on the right hand side, the blue bar, the dark blue bars, it's North America and Europe. And you can see in that 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 age range, it's actually smaller than actually in the older generations who are already in the workforce, already in maybe chosen careers. And so these people that are normally coming to choose careers aren't there. Where on contrary, if you look at in India on the left-hand side and the light blue bars, actually we've still got a lot of talent coming into the workforce that are highly skilled. So in previous webinars, we've talked about the fact that you should be looking for future locations. And again, we'll touch on that in a minute, but actually also doubling down on India from an ITS and a BPS perspective potentially is a good strategy because that's where the talent is. And on the next slide, we start to look in a bit more detail about where are the locations that people are considering. So this is not all about a locations webinar, but actually as sourcing professionals, we do need to think about where are the sources of talent, because that also may drive our sourcing strategy and the providers that we look to work with, because certain providers are stronger from certain markets than others. So you can see India, which is a repeat of the other slide there. But if you look at like Latin America, that's got a talent pyramid, which is a healthy one. And then the one that we get a lot of quick inquiries about right now is around Africa. And you can see there that the call out really is 197 million babies in the last period versus 85 million from China. So Africa is a massive source of potential talent as we look to move forward in future years. So this webinar was to talk about the fact that it's all about managing the impact now. But actually, I also think that sourcing professionals should be thinking about and what's the long-term strategy we need to be deploying. And that leads us into thinking about some of the locations that we should be in. Because if on the next slide, we start to look at, well, what's the future outlook like? And these slides are really interesting, I think, for me, as we start thinking about, well, what's the strategy that we should be thinking about? Again, not just a location strategy, but a location strategy in terms of also what's our provider strategy and who are the providers that we're working with, who are in these markets. But you can actually see that if you look at it in terms of growth of the working age population, actually we're in red in a number of the traditional locations that we may be looking at. I know if you look at sort of some of the places sort of in Brazil, if you look at Colombia, Costa Rica, they're not expected to sort of see any growth. If you look in Europe, definitely in terms of places like Czech Republic, Lithuania, Poland, which are great sources of talent today for IT services and BPO services, over the next 25, 30 years, they're not going to see any growth in terms of the population. The ones that you do see there in green are actually the ones in Africa again that we've touched on. So it leads us to think that actually the sources of talent in the future, and we are talking to a lot of service providers who are investing in Africa now, thinking about the talent of the future. And I think as we get more and more providers investing in Africa, we'll actually see that the local talent will develop, the managerial talent will develop, and it will set up as a strong position for both ITS and BPS services in the future. So it's just there's a changing workforce out there, and I think that sourcing professionals, as we all are, should be thinking about where are my sources of talent going to be, because that is going to dictate the service provider footprint that you also need in the future. I think there's also a focus around sort of attrition, and I think Banushi, you're going to cover some of the concerns around attrition.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that has happened is that, the fear of attrition has led to a sort of a role inflation. It's making decisions about moving smaller roles to larger roles when they're not really ready for it. Perhaps there could be a genuine reason to staff these resources in more senior roles, right? Such as service delivery concerns or project complexities that require these resources to be moved. And I think that's completely fine. But overall, putting junior resources in your senior bracket has sort of been becoming a norm, which shouldn't be the case. And the reason for that is we've tried to, explain the reason through this standard and inflated pyramid. So what we've done here is this is like a simulation of a standard offshore AD pyramid, staffing pyramid, right? So if you look on the left side, you'll see that this is the current kind of scenario. And if you inflate that even by a small percentage, you'll see that the overall blended fee increases by 5 to 6%. So even a small change in the staffing pyramid can lead to this entire 5 to 6% increase in overall fee, right? So there is a sort of an impact or a consequence of going ahead with these role inflations or early promotions in organizations. So, of course, and that was the issue, because if you're hiring junior developers at such a high rate, then you're ultimately not able to find resources that you can pay such a premium for. So if we move to the next slide, we want to show you the overall impact. We've discussed a lot of reasons, right? Due to which services prices have moved up over the past year. But we wanted to give you a view of all the impact that has been created since 2017. So we've taken an index of 100. If you see on the left side, we've started from 100 index in 2017, and now in 2022, this is the actual rate increase that we've come down to. So at an overall level, of course, there are multiple things that you would see here, right? The first thing is that BPO rate increases are a lot lower than IT. And we're talking about transactional processes in BPO, right? So within finance and accounting, consider an accounting invoice processing process, and within CXM, direct calling. And when we look at generic IT related roles, so commoditized roles, traditional skill sets, for example, Java or .NET, these are slightly higher than the BPO related pricing increases. The most, the highest increase, as you would predict, is in the next generation skills. So take your cybersecurity, OpenStack type of skills. They're pretty high. And in fact, over the past, in 2020, 2021, the dip was sort of consistent across all of these skill sets, but the rate increase has been a lot higher when it comes to these next generation skills. So overall prices have increased a lot for these specialist skill sets. Any comments?
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to comment because yesterday I was looking at this data for onshore as well. And I feel like that's probably a question we're going to get, right? This is offshore. This is India. The BPO has some Philippines data in it as well, because that's where a lot of contact center happens. I should say the CXM has Philippines in it. But when we looked at the onshore, just in the US specifically, I know we have a lot of US companies on the line. This was actually a steeper curve almost across the board, and the IT apps was just as high as the IT infrastructure. So even worse if you were to look purely at US-based roles. And none of that's probably a surprise given the audience we have on the phone, that 94% of you or something had significant increases in costs. But just wanted to answer that question because we do look at both. We look across different countries, and there's a ton of a whole database of pricing data behind all of this, but that forecast is still going up a bit more, both onshore and offshore. So, sorry, go ahead, Benishi. I know you were.
No, definitely. In fact, the very aggressive, hyper competitive price prices that had been negotiated by service providers a couple of years back because of COVID, they're not able to sustain that anymore. So a lot of those type of advisory related inquiries are also coming up within the practice and within the firms. We hear clients asking about this all the time. So with that, I would move to the next section, which is about the survival strategies, right? What are the things that sourcing professionals should do? So again, like Amy mentioned, category managers, CPOs, what should they do? What are the 5 things that they should do to be able to sustain within the inflationary environment? So the first thing we want to talk about is sharpening your sourcing approaches to distinguish between run and change efforts. So if we move to the next slide, I want to give a little bit more context about how we see sourcing strategies as different for run versus change efforts. And this is kind of intuition based as well, right? Because if you think about run efforts, they would be more outsourcing reliant, more managed services type of models. You don't want to spend a lot of your efforts into those efforts, into run engagements, because they're typically commoditized, can be managed offshore, and should not be managed by your internal employees as a whole. So while when you look at change efforts, they should be more internal employee reliant, can be more staff off based, and you want to spend more energies into managing those type of engagements, right? So you can think about adding more specialist providers to the mix and building that diversified portfolio. You can think about not just local shoring, right, but best shoring. Where is the location where you'll find the best talent for these change efforts? So it shouldn't be about just offshoring or finding local resources, but nowadays the game has become more about finding the right talent wherever they're located. So if you look at the overall picture, when it comes to your sourcing strategy for run versus change, run has become more about just driving more and more savings, whereas change has become more about fighting your talent wars. And one of the things that we have observed about, augmenting talent is with respect to automation, right? So when automation can help improve your overall talent management experience, and that can be done through, I think, 3 or 4 ways. We have some, client examples of how they have helped used automation to drive productivity, save man hours, and also help their resources focus on more judgment intensive or complex tasks. So that has been a key strategy, and sourcing teams should definitely look at following different approaches for these.
Yeah, I see there's a question about efficiency, doing more with the existing number of software developers, and 100%. And you get there through, processes, agile processes are an example, automation. Benishi just gave a couple of examples, and there were some examples in the last slide of automation to reduce the need for talent. And we continue to see that. We see it on the IT side. I would say we continue to see it across BPS as well, as processes are more likely to get automated to displace talent needs on that side of the house.
Yeah, definitely. I think another example of another example of how different contracting models or different sourcing strategies can be used can be seen with respect to agile IT contracts. So when we think about agile, it's all about thinking as you go, more flexibility, more simplicity in your engagements, right? So when it comes to sourcing teams, there are many different approaches that can be followed with respect to contracting models. And the risk level actually goes at different stages for each of these models, right? So the first one being time and material. This is, again, this is a whole continuum of models, but when we think about the most let's say, a risk-free type of model for the service provider, it's time and material. So we usually recommend that when you have a new service provider engagement, this is the type of model that you should be going for. And moving on slowly from one model to another, when you think about agile pod, it gives some sort of spread, flex within the framework, because it's sort of built per sprint. When you look at target price, again, not a very common model that we've observed in the market, but typically has this whole estimation sort of framework that is built in, with where the target price is decided upfront by both parties, which is the enterprise as well as the service provider. Moving on to fixed bid, which, as the name suggests, it's talking about fixing fixing something. But when we have seen it in the market, it's more about fixing story points rather than the entire scope of the engagement. Because again, like I pointed out, agile is all about flex. So you want to allow for some flexibility even when you think about fixed bid contracting. And then you move to the other end of the spectrum with respect to high risk borne by the provider, which is the output-based service delivery. So that is completely story point based, and high risk lies with the service provider in this particular case. So, the reason we explain this entire concept is mainly because we want to show how there are different contracting models that are suitable for various stages of maturity within different agile IT contracts, right? So through this example, we can see how sourcing teams should also use different strategies when it comes to their engagements.
Yeah, this is a great example of the different models specifically for agile IT, but you could extract this as well. It's really representative of any type of outsourcing where you have a range of T&M all the way to output based or managed services, or even outcome based in some areas. And I think if you look at the, most commonly we see people in that left-hand side of time and material or some kind of fixed capacity type model. If you look at the risk borne by the provider, though, you're really shifting that responsibility for cost management, which you could say is part of the risk in this environment, from internal, from the buyer to the provider. The way that kind of connects back with that last slide that Venushi talked about, between run and build, is really thinking about which of our processes or our outsourced service areas are kind of steady state and can be handed over in more of a managed services model, and which ones are more on the build side where we need, we're really looking for specific skills and we want to have more, say over the control over the costs, and we're willing to take the cost hike if it gets us better quality. That would be more appropriate on the T&M side. So one thing that I haven't seen sourcing teams do as much in the past or be as aggressive about is understanding these different commercial models and thinking about their work and segmenting it out to help their stakeholders, work with stakeholders to decide which parts of the work can fit into which of these models. And as we'll talk about in a minute, sometimes that means having multiple different providers for different types of work as well, going with a more, seasoned, sort of less innovative provider for your managed services for your run work, and maybe a more, specialist provider for the build work. I would say, although this is more IT than BPS, you can think about a lot of different processes in that light and shape your commercial models around it.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I was going to add to that as well, just on those pricing models. I think the only thing I would say is from a BPS perspective, I think we definitely see time and materials on one end, and then outcome based being almost a desired goal on the other end, and then there might be slightly different models in the middle, but definitely a focus around the contracting model to fix the need and pass or share more risk between the provider and the buyer. If we do look at the next solution that we're talking about on the next slide, so it leads into what you were saying. So more is the title. So we're actually seeing a move towards more locations, more suppliers, more captives. I would say, though, I think this is fairly specific, or can be fairly specific to IT. And I think it is actually all about the context, as we say there, that I think that when we're looking at organizations looking to bring transformation to their organization, they're starting to think about who are the specialists in the technology stack, who are the functional or methodological providers that we should be thinking about. And then if we're in a specific industry or a particular function, are there specific providers we should be working with as well? So we definitely see on the IT side, that ability to be able to think about versus working with one generalist type provider, being able to focus down. I think on the BPS side, we're still seeing quite a focus on consolidation. We used to see consolidation was a big thing 5-10 years ago. I think during the pandemic, we saw a bit more diversification to balance the risk. I think on the BPS side, we're seeing a little bit more around actually consolidation could still be the right thing to be able to focus your costs, be able to work with those providers and really engage with them. So I think we do see slightly different approaches. I think that for big transformation initiatives, definitely a push to working with the specialist in their particular area. For generic run work, as we said, then maybe consolidating with providers that you're already working with can give you an opportunity to start to push for competitive pricing or changing the commercial models because you've got an established relationship. So I think it is all about the context that you're looking in, but being able to work with specialist providers is definitely growing in the IT space. We're also seeing a focus as we go on to the next slide. We're actually seeing a focus on the location. So we touched on it earlier when we looked at the issue with the talent pyramids. But what we're actually seeing is that organizations are exploring new locations. So immediately for now, but then also thinking about that longer term picture. So it's not just about the immediate talent demand, but there's also balancing the risk. So during the pandemic, we saw countries like the Philippines struggling maybe to get everyone working from home and people being sort of instructed to go back into the into the workplace now, and people are starting to think about, well, how do we get the right operating model for the future? Is it a hybrid model? Where would that model work? So new locations are emerging all the time, and you can see some examples there. In Europe, for example, Croatia, Serbia are all areas that we know service providers and enterprises both are investing in. We look at Middle East and Africa that we touched on before, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Ghana, a couple of locations that we're familiar with in terms of Nigeria and Microsoft and Teleperformance making investments, Ghana with Google and Prudential. So organizations are starting to think, well, actually our traditional organization locations that we've always relied on may not necessarily be the ones that we can rely on in the future based on that talent pyramid thing we talked about earlier. So where are the right locations that we should be looking at? So thinking about more is more and diversifying, I think definitely from a provider perspective, makes sense if you've got a complex business where you need those key skills, and then from locations to be able to balance the risk.
Yeah, Dave, I think just to comment on the more is more, because I feel like that's kind of an anathema to procurement people, right? We've been all about volume concentration, supplier concentration, consolidation of locations, right? And I had this conversation yesterday with a company that's got way too many providers and was, we're like, I think you have to think of it as the first step is to go through that consolidation and to really rationalize your locations and get the right number and the right suppliers. So you may have, for many companies, you've already done that. You've already gotten down to maybe one BPO provider and 3 IT providers, right? And I'm just throwing out numbers. It really depends on a lot of factors there. That's kind of 101 per portfolio strategy. What we're seeing now is if you've already gone through that process, going and looking at where can we add specialists to supplement capabilities and talent, what locations might, serve us well in the future, serve us well right now in this environment. So it's I kind of think of it as like sourcing 101 versus sourcing 201 or 501, right? Of really getting specific about where that more needs to go. But you already know that the suppliers you have are consolidated because they're the best and they're the best fit for you.
Yeah, and I also think it's important that procurement and sourcing professionals, and I'm sure everyone on this call is already doing this, but starting to think about, well, working very closely with a business to understand where the business is going in the future as well, and trying to anticipate those future demands. And it may be providers we've got today are great for what we've got, but where we want to be in 6-12 months, are those providers the right ones? I was talking to a service provider yesterday who keeps coming up to barriers of, well, we've just consolidated our supplier base. And really the answer for them needs to be, well, what makes you different to the rest of the supplier base? How do you differentiate yourself to the market? And procurement professionals are doing their job really well. We'll be thinking about, okay, well, what do I need in the future? And is my current supply base going to give me that down the road, or do I need to be thinking about diversifying? Because no one's going to support going away from consolidation just for the sake of going away from consolidation. But if there's a good, valid business reason, then I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
If we look at,
I think if you look at, sorry, just I think one last point. If you look at it from an overall perspective, right? So Amy spoke about the cost angle and David just talked about the business angle. And the third thing is risk also, right? So you want to think about your overall portfolio from a risk-related angle as well, and figure out whether, you know, your offshoring ratios, are you outsourcing too much? Are you offshoring too much? And then think about, okay, maybe we should add some newer providers in one particular nearshore location just to offset that risk that we would have been facing earlier because of offshoring too much. So these are the reasons that typically lead to diversification.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Panushi. So the third tactic that we talk about is prepare for price increase demand. So I think we all know, and from the quick poll we did earlier, we know that people are seeing demands for price increases. I think this is, again, a bit Procurement 101, but I think it's good to remind people because it's surprising how many people aren't actually doing some of this. But do your pricing homework. Really understand how your pricing compares to the market, because we've seen examples where people think they're paying a good rate and actually then negotiate and are really proud that they get a 10% reduction or keep it flat, whatever, but actually to market, they're paying way above the market. And that's why a provider can give you an attractive rate, because you're already paying above market. So our advice is to really understand how your pricing sits and start to think much more about the total cost of ownership or total cost of operations versus just looking at, well, what's my rate card say? Because what we see is often the rate card might be attractive, but actually there's lots of add-on services or lots of add-on operational costs or relationship and account management costs that get added in to these contracts. And so it's really about understanding, what am I paying the supplier for the service, but also what's the total cost of that operation to deliver it against as well. Because we know that actually wages are 56 to 60% of the total operating costs of a BPO service. There are other elements as well that you should be familiar with and understanding that, because I think this is important as we think about how you control the cost increases that you get. And it leads us to the next slide, actually, which is that starts to talk about what some of the mechanisms you can use to think about it in terms of COLA was a familiar clause for many of us who've been in procurement for a long time, but actually during the pandemic, a lot of them got ignored, or there was agreements that they wouldn't be implemented. Actually, they're becoming more and more important now. So organizations can start thinking about, how do I predict what the longer term is? So I'm going to get short-term increases, but I want to be able to control that and budget for that for the next 2, 3, 5 years. So we're seeing that there's different types of COLA clauses, like so a fixed increment. There's the tying it to CPI, so that variable index, or cap and collar, where you agree what the minimum or the maximum of the increase would be. But we're really seeing that actually organizations are realizing actually the COLA clauses are there to protect both sides, actually, so both sides know what they can expect, and actually people can plan and forecast around that. I think the other thing that we wanted to call out on this slide is just that point at the bottom, which is we do hear a lot about, well, we're having to increase people's wages by 15% because we've got to get the talent and we're in a very competitive market. I think the thing that we did in our analysis to show actually just a 15% wage increase doesn't have a 15% impact on the price, or it shouldn't have. And you should be expecting, if there's a 15% wage increase, that's up to a 7 to 9% impact on the price versus 15%, because not all the cost of the service is driven by wages, etc. So it's just about being really mindful of all of the things that make up your pricing, and then thinking about how do we measure that and manage that in the future through COLA, but really understanding what the key drivers to price changes are, and being really mindful of that.
Yeah, and it was pointed out to me that the numbers on the bottom here, this is kind of modeled after BPO. The numbers for ITS are even greater. There's higher margins there. So the difference between wage increase and actual cost or price increase is a bigger gap when you look at IT apps type roles, some of those digital skills we talked about earlier. So they've really got to, understand where you're starting out. To David's point, if you started out, you came out of COVID, or, started out COVID at the bottom of the market, you're going to get hit a lot harder and have a lot more trouble recruiting and retaining talent than if you were already kind of overpaying there. So there's a lot of moving parts in this. I was also reminded that, the changes in FX are starting to impact this. So foreign exchange rates, can defray some of this difference as well. So you want to be thinking about that, and nobody can predict the future, but as much as possible, factoring that into your model. Those are all really big components of the cost model. I think just to put a fine point on it, when you think about TCO modeling for outsourced services, it's complex and it's dynamic, and it's not something that you modeled 5 years ago and it's the same. You've got to keep looking at what's happening with the market and all the external environment. So with that, I'll jump on to the next one, which is really understanding the end-to-end workforce strategies. And I think David made this point as well, understanding your stakeholders' plans long-term. But, we're talking about external workforce here, right? We're not talking about buying widgets that have no, this is people in the services world. We're talking about people, human capital, and it's important to think about how all these different parts of the workforce fit together. So as sourcing professionals, we're typically thinking about outsourced workforce and potentially contingent workforce. And, you could even say contingent, sometimes HR is looking at contingent, sometimes procurement is, but really the bottom two bubbles on here, those are directly impacted by the hired workforce as well, which is typically, HR's domain. I don't know many sourcing people who sit around and think about, are we hiring or are we downsizing our full-time talent roles other than within their own procurement teams. But you've got to really think about the workforce strategy across the organization. What we tend to see is there was a lot of challenges in hiring and retention. The same challenges we're talking about on the outsourced side were just as acute on the full-time side. But now we're starting to hear, as we get into a little bit more economic uncertainty, about companies pausing their hiring. So they were hiring very rapidly, bringing a lot of people on, a lot of again, the Great Resignation. And now they're starting to say, no, we're going to have a hiring freeze just in case we go into a recession. Well, anybody who's ever worked in corporate America during a hiring freeze knows that as soon as you get a freeze, as a hiring manager, as a budget holder, you immediately start bringing on either more contingent or more outsourced parties, right? So you fill those gaps through the other two pieces on here. That's not to say that 1 + 1 = 3 and the bubble is always exactly the same size. But you do start to see parts of that, like a balloon, when you squeeze it, the air goes somewhere else, at least to some extent. So you really, got, as a sourcing person, need to think about long-term and understand long-term, what is our, what are my stakeholders' workforce strategies? Do they intend for this to be more internal? Are they, dealing with the fact that they have big projects that they can't add headcount to, and therefore they, maybe we do need to bring on another provider or make sure we have talent access? Do we need to look at more contingent? How does our contingent to hire, process work, and is that streamlined enough, and is it working for us? So there's a lot of different moving parts here, and I think as whether we're category managers, sourcing managers, or even a head of indirect, we tend to think of those as very separate. I'm going to go out and RFP a service provider, and I'm going to go out and RFP an MSP or a staffing provider, and maybe aren't thinking about the internal workforce. But these are very interconnected bubbles that we need to be all, or interconnected sources of talent, I should say, that we all need to be thinking about and aware of. And if you really think about that, we at Everest Group, we do a lot of work around strategic workforce planning. And on the next slide, just kind of illustrating some of the steps around there. It's interesting to me because when I look at what strategic workforce planning process looks like, it sounds a lot like the planning process for the sourcing team, demand planning for, you know, anything I've seen in manufacturing as well, right? It's just that we're talking about people that are, you know, and people are much more nuanced and difficult than, don't tell the supply chain people I said that, but, you know, services is more complex. When you're bringing on people, that's harder than just making more of a widget. So, you know, you're assessing future demand, you're looking at your existing profile in terms of the skills and capabilities of talent. You are deciding what are our talent sourcing options. Are we going to build? Are we going to buy? Are we going to rent? Right? You can equivocate all of those to hire, contract, or outsource. And then you're, you know, kind of matching your demand and supply across these different providers, and monitoring your supply and demand in the labor market on an ongoing basis. We have seen over time that, you know, historically there was not a great workforce view across contingent and hired, and outsourced labor wasn't even really connected to that. I think over time companies have gotten better at looking at the talent landscape and workforce planning across contingent and hired. But as a category manager for outsourced services, you really need to bundle that in as well and understand what that plan is, and understand that demand pattern is going to affect your ability in the future, or your needs in the future. And then the last piece is just thinking about value management. And Benushi, why don't we just to take us through that last point?
Yeah, so I think just to, you know, talk about this last point, procurement adds value in a lot of different ways in organizations, right? It's not just about cost savings or even just maintaining the cash flow, which is what is typically there in a procurement scorecard, but it is about a lot of other things such as risk management, ensuring that there's an adequate supply at all times, maintaining those relationships with suppliers, and, you know, driving that constant flow of innovative ideas as well. So in fact, we've received a lot of questions in the past couple of months on this aspect as well, right? How do we include these qualitative features into our procurement scorecard, and sort of, you know, tell the organization that this is also something that we've been adding value as. So one example, for instance, is also ESG, right? Like many procurement departments take special initiatives to kind of, you know, align with the ESG objectives of the organization. And this has been coming up a lot in the past, again, a year or so. Which is around, you know, maybe say ensuring that there's diverse spend within your supply base, or it can also be around ensuring that your outsourced service suppliers have the right type of environmental certifications, green buildings, those type of things. So these things also add value, and they sort of, you know, go towards creating impact in the organization as a whole, but it's not something that's measured very well. So one advice that we want to give to sourcing teams is that you have to take credit for all that you've done to get through the last couple of years, right? Whether it's ensuring that your supply was available at all points of time, or just creating the right type of impact in the organization, or even small process improvement changes that you've made that have led to a constant flow of, you know, information across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Benushi.
Sorry, Amy, I was just going to.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, and I think this is a question we also had in the pre-work, but around risk management, it's always a question that we get around how do you take credit for something that you've avoided from happening, and it is a great question. I think it's one that I've always been challenged with in the past, and I think that for me it's about being really clear about the mechanisms and the governance you've put in place to manage that risk. So it's not just saying, well, nothing went bad, so I must have done a great job, but it's, well, what have you done proactively to do that? Whether it's assessing the risk of your suppliers on a quarterly basis, knowing if they're likely to become insolvent, or they've got massive reputational risk that's going to have a negative impact on you, or whatever it is, but actually showing there's a level of governance around risk management, and not just taking credit because something bad didn't happen, because you may not, you can't take credit for something bad not happening, but you can show what you've done to manage that part. Then I think that's how procurement can take credit for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I did want to talk about that slide a bit. And many of you are probably familiar with the value pyramid. That it's a Hackett, to give full credit, it's a Hackett value pyramid that's been around for probably, well, I can tell you it was developed in 2008. And it has supply assurance at the bottom, and then we get into TCO, and then we get into caring about, supply assurance, then cost, TCO, demand management, and then innovation at the top, or sorry, value at the top being, things like innovation and risk management and cash flow and all of that. And I think that was actually developed before the 2008 recession, and focus really did get to cost. We kind of put aside some of the innovation and the value stuff at the top. What's really interesting to me, though, and got me thinking about this, is that through COVID, we had assumed, I was at Hackett for 10 years, people know that, we had kind of said that supply assurance is just bread and butter and table stakes, and we should be focusing on TCO and above and getting to the top of that pyramid. But what we learned through COVID is that supply assurance is not a given. It's no longer, even if you have the best processes and you're living through 2022, you're still dealing with supply assurance problems. And I think in a bit, it's not that the pyramid was wrong, it's that it's been kind of spread out or flipped on its head, and that we have to work on all of these things all the time. And despite the focus on supply assurance and costs, we haven't lost, if anything, ESG and risk have been elevated to be focuses as well. So rather than thinking of it as a pyramid now, I kind of think of it as, all these various segments that we have to make work together. And I think that as sourcing professionals, if you're having trouble hitting a savings goal, even more reason to make sure that you're hitting the other, 6 areas on here on your scorecard, measuring them and showing what you're doing well there. You do have to preface that with the business so they understand why, but we all know we're in inflationary times. We all know what's going on in the outside environment. So having those hard talks up front, I think, is really, really important. And I think, so with that, we can jump on to kind of wrap this up. Just in terms of moderating cost increases, evaluating, thinking about the commercial models that you have, taking a fresh look at some of the providers and the location profiles, staying on top of your cost analysis, understanding the workforce strategy, and then measuring and highlighting value beyond the cost savings. I want to jump into right now. We can skip the next quick poll because I know we hit on a lot of the questions, but as we went, so we're a little bit behind on time. But I want to make sure we hit on the end offer as well as a couple more of these questions before we get to the top of the hour. So just in terms of how do you make this happen, right? It's really about addressing the near-term challenges while setting yourself up for long-term uncertainty. So one thing we wanted to end on here is that we have been in a state of increasing costs and talent shortages for at least 6 months. Some would argue a lot longer than that. We're still at a point that of uncertainty. Many are forecasting a recession. Are we in a recession? Has it already started? Are we not going to have a recession because employment is so high? Every economist can speculate in a different direction. If I had a crystal ball on that, we would probably not be on a webinar right now. But the reality is that there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think as we talk about all of these things that we're doing, putting in, whether you're giving a price increase or you're making some kind of structural change, you need to think about what's appropriate for the long term and how you build in flexibility in the short term, or short term, in case things level out. So, we see it may be right to choose a new location or bring on a new supplier. It may not be right to lock in pricing in a 3 or 5 year contract. So you really need to think about that. You need to, be aware that the market could change in a month or in 6 months or in 2 years. But again, some of the structural changes we talked about up front, we think are here to stay, and not, we're not going to instantly have an extra 1 million people in the workforce and these high demand skill sets. So really understand that, develop playbooks, think about the different scenarios, and understand how your workforce planning is going to change ad hoc as you see different, demand and supply imbalances. With that, I want to put out one offer. When we do these webinars, we like to offer people a chance to do a outsourced service rate comparison. One of the things we mentioned a couple times is that it really matters where you're starting out compared to the market. If you're at the 90th percentile, you're in a different position than if you're at the 10th percentile in your market. So there is a link right now in the chat. Please click that. You can open it and you can finish it after, you can fill the thing out after you finish. But this is for buy-side enterprises. If you're a service provider, you don't need to do this. It's a different set of data, and you can talk to your client director about how you access that for service providers. If you're on a buy side, please do this. If you are a current member of our outsourcing excellence program, you actually already have access to this data. So go ahead. It's in Pricebook, which is one of the tools in our program. You don't need to click the form, but happy to have your client director or your account manager help you with accessing that data, or reach out to me or David or Benushi as well. Let's see if we can fit. We have a lot of questions here, and we have about 3 minutes to cover them. I know there's a lot of questions about different industries, and I just want to say that we're looking really across industries. We certainly see, industries that do a lot more outsourcing, more impacted by some of these changes. But I wouldn't say that any of this is specific to one industry versus others. These are kind of global problems. And again, it's not even a country level. The inflation we see in the US is equal or worse in other countries as well. So nobody necessarily escapes from it. I know we have one question that I was going to talk about when David had the TCO point. Given inflationary pressures, are there alternative indices we should be considering in pricing models? A lot of people use CPI. David, do you want to comment on that one? We talked about that earlier. You're on mute.
Sorry, someone had to do it and no one had done it for 58 minutes. So I thought I would do it in the last 2 minutes, just because it's a rule of all sorts of conference calls and webinars. Yeah, so most people we see do use CPI, but actually we've been talking to our pricing team about this, and actually we're starting to see others starting to use the Hewitt or Mercer compensation indices. So it's a newer or a different model that looks at sort of the compensation indices, as the title says, but actually gives you a different view to the CPI. So that's a couple of the alternatives to CPI that we're seeing being used in the market.
Yeah, good point. So I think we hit a lot of these questions, and we're just at the last minute. So I want to wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. We were trying to answer them. I was trying to throw them out while we spoke, so they kind of fit in with the conversation. I know we got a lot before. We are going to go through those, and we'll try to respond to them. We'll respond back to them to where we can, and in some cases, we may suggest that an analyst gives a more specific answer if they were a topic a little bit separated from this. So, all right. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.